Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning.
Welcome. John, this is the part we were talking about that feels a little weird when you're like, good morning, everyone, and you can't see anybody, right? Welcome to Coffee Talk, everyone. We hope there's people out there tuning in this morning. We are Southborough Youth and Family Services. My name is Sarah Castle. I am the Director of Southborough Youth and Family Services. And with me this morning are my two very good friends and co-workers here. We have Megan Island, who's our Assistant Director. Good morning, Megan.
Good morning.
Shannon Knyman, who is our Program Coordinator, excuse me.
Sorry, good morning.
Here. Good morning, Shannon.
Hello.
And also, we are so excited to have John Mattleman with us this morning. John and I haven't seen each other for a very long time, and we're going to hear a little bit more about John in a few minutes. He does lots of different things, so I'm very excited to have you on the show this morning. And cheers, everybody. Welcome.
Thanks for having me here this morning.
Yes. So how is everyone? Anything exciting happening with anyone this morning?
No, day like 3,299 of the pandemic, you know?
It's been hard. I stopped asking people like what's new because that's not a good question to ask these days.
No.
It's true. Nobody even knows how to answer the question, how are you? You know, which is sad.
Yeah.
I try to
Hanging
say,
in there.
yeah,
Hanging in there.
I'm hanging in there. I'm doing the best I can. I'm fine.
I always say I'm okay on a curve. Like we have to give, teachers gave test results on a curve. I'm okay on a curve.
There you go. That's great. That's great. Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, John, so I mentioned just a second ago that you and I haven't seen one another for a very long time. John used to be the Director of Needham Youth and Family Services, but you had retired. What year was that?
Yeah, so I retired from that 3 years ago. I'm still working full time, but I
3
left
years
that.
ago.
Yeah.
I feel like it was longer that we haven't seen one another, but you have been doing a lot since then. I'd love to hear from you what you've been doing since then, but also, you know, to tell our viewers about your background and about your current work.
Yeah, so I worked at, as you say, at Needham for 24 years, and I left 3 years ago, and I'm now doing consulting in two parts. I gave a talk called The Secret Life of Teens and Tweens, where I tell a lot of stories about my own kids, like when my son Jake came home drunk. That was a lovely event. Or when my daughter said, I'll never speak to you again, and she really meant it. And I do a lot of trainings for parents, professionals, for teachers around anxiety, suicide, and self-harm. But mine are a little bit different because I want to give people only two things: the courage to ask the right questions and the language. What the heck do you say if someone says, I wish I were dead, for example? How do you deal with like a child who's anxious? How do you work with that? So I really try to give people skills. I always say that people can use immediately because who has time to wait?
That's great. So would it be an accurate statement then to say that you've been doing a lot of talks, you've been doing consulting for a number of, who do you do consulting for mostly?
Well, I do it on my own. I partner with a lot of different organizations too. Mostly what I've done this spring and was this presentation called Teens, Tweens, and Quarantines. And in the fall, I've been working with teachers a lot and with parents as we return to school.
That's great. I think, Shannon, you actually were one of the folks in attendance at that talk. Is that right?
It's right, yeah. I don't know if it was the one that had 1,100 people there or not. It was in Natick.
Okay.
Well, in Natick, you know, like through Natick. I don't know how this works anymore, but and it was amazing. You know,
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
So, John, we wanted to talk to you a little bit more. Before we started, you were, you know, we thought that this conversation could go in many different directions. And given the work that you've done working supporting parents with tweens and teens, and your work with teens and tweens in general, you thought that would be a really nice place to focus, and particularly on anxiety and the impact of the pandemic. I know, Shannon, you had a question that you were going to ask. Shannon happens to have tweens and teens in her house.
I do. Well, I have just a tween. I have a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. And so friends and these guys here, we've had a lot of conversations about social development, that, that age, teens and tweens, it's supposed to be this age of gaining some autonomy and learning who they are, and that our kids aren't able to do that right now. So we were wondering, can you speak a little bit about developmentally what's typical pre-COVID, and then how is COVID affecting?
That's great. Sure. So let's go back to March, and let's imagine you're a teen or a tween, and you've been told there's no school for a day, a week, a month, the rest of the year. That is a miracle. How did that happen? And then virtually the next day, you're told you have to be home 24/7, quarantined with your parents. That's torture. That's prison. And that's what it was like for our young people. They have highly reactive brains anyway, and now we put them in this incredibly complex situation, and they're all over the place. So at first it was kind of fun. Then they realized, hey, I miss my friends. I miss my teachers. That was a revelation to a lot of kids. I miss my way of life. And it was really challenging. And I think that teachers, parents, and teens really burned out in the spring because we were so remote from each other. We were, as I explained before, it was pandemic learning. It was under this huge header of COVID-19 and this huge stressor. It wasn't just that we were virtually learning, it was under that. So it was really challenging. And then, of course, the losses were immense. If you love baseball, you didn't have your baseball season. If you were a senior in high school, you didn't have graduation. So there were incredible losses, and these continued in the summer. Maybe you always went to mom and dad's lake house or grandparents' lake house, but you couldn't do that. So that continued, and then the uncertainty was just maddening for students and for parents. And so this has been a time, as we all know, of unrest. And if we focused on all the things we can't control all the time, we would drive ourselves crazy. And we have. I certainly have at times. But I think one of the keys that we can take away is let's focus on what we can control, because that's stabilizing and that's energizing and that's empowering.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. I'm curious if we thought about, well, Shannon, I think in particular you were asking that question because you said just a second ago, you have a tween and one that's maybe an emerging tween. Mm-hmm. He's like a pre-tween, if that's a thing.
He has a 12-year-old brother, so he has moments where he thinks he's 12.
Yeah. But so, for Shannon or somebody who doesn't quite have a teen or tween quite yet, what's normally developing at that stage for a young person?
Yeah, well, the most important thing is that we parents have to do a better job in giving our kids license to say whatever they want, because that way we know what's going on with them. If we're going to guess, we're going to be wrong. It reminds me when my son was born, my daughter had just turned 3. And I said to her, okay, Jessie, let's talk about the first night Jake was home with my wife from the hospital. Let's talk about all the things that are not good about having Jake here. And she said, he cries too much. I'm not with mom as much. And I gave her license. And by the way, by the second night, I said, all right, Jessie, let's do that game again. We're going to say 3 things that are challenging about having Jake at home. She said, Dad, you don't have to worry. I love him. So, sometimes these aren't long conversations, but I think the point is we have to give our kids license to share with us without us jumping in. I'm a fixer parent, so this is particularly challenging for me. We're always jumping in and say, it'll get better. Don't worry about it, that sort of thing. And we need to do more listening. The best way to do that actually with kids of any age, and I'm talking about through college because I've done this. I always say my kids are so screwed. When you're the therapist, Dad, oh, your kids are so screwed. But I have conversations with my kids in the dark, because here's what happens. kids are looking at our faces as the adults, as parents, and they're trying to decipher what we're thinking, what we're saying in our faces. And we're very expressive. So if we're scrunching up our face, we might be communicating, that's weird. That's why are you thinking that way, or that's wrong. So I literally had thousands of conversations with my kids in the dark where we couldn't see each other's faces, where we really could express things very openly.
That's an interesting tactic. I like it.
We used to do that in the car. Parents know that if you're in a car with a teen, you have better conversations because they don't like eye contact. So I always say it's not environmentally sound to be driving around forever. So let's just shut off the lights and have conversations. And when my son was in college and got into some trouble, it was more than a little bit of trouble. This is several years ago. He came home. I shut off all the lights. He walked in my house. He took a left into the living room and he said, "Dad, I know you're sitting in here somewhere." And I was there and we had a conversation in the dark about his not so great behavior as a college student.
That's so funny. That'll save you on gas mileage too.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah. And electricity, actually. It's a good strategy.
Yeah, one of the conversations that friends and I have been having is like this dichotomy that we foresee happening, which is either with them being around us so much, we're going to see some separation anxiety, or we're going to have the kids that are just like, free, I'm going to go crazy.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, let's talk about that. So not everyone felt badly about being home. If you're an introvert, that actually felt relieving for people. Like facing the big bad world is challenging. But now that we've been home for an extended period of time, it's impacted everyone. And I want to talk about my sister's dog, Bailey. My sister and her husband went back to work. Their dog, Bailey, is experiencing this separation like they're back at work. So it's everyone on the planet. And I think that what we have to see about kids is how debilitating it is, both in depth and in length. We know that going into public spaces can be challenging. Well, I literally, if I have to go somewhere, I am like nervous about it. I was never nervous before. So we have to make allowances for those sort of things. And we have to know that anxiety is now part of the landscape. We know that the mental health surge has been real. We talked about the physical surge before, but the mental health surge is real. Some of the latest statistics are just overwhelming. 18 to 24-year-olds, 25% of that age group considered suicide during COVID. And we know that 40% of Americans now say they have anxiety. So we as parents and professionals need to model some good behavior. We're the captains of the ship, but we also have to know what to say to our kids. And I'm happy to talk about that sort of thing if it would be helpful too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I'll give an example. By the way, I tell stories about my son and my daughter. They all know about it, and they're okay. So when my son had anxiety, this is pre-COVID, but it works very well here. He didn't want to talk to me about his anxiety because he didn't have the words, he didn't have the wherewithal. I didn't want to speak to his dad, and it was very frustrating for me. So I said, "Okay, Jake, here's the deal. Every day I'm going to ask you to give it a number." And so 10 being the worst, 1 being the best. He said, "All right, Dad, I'll do that. Just leave me alone." So every day I would ask him what his number was. So if he was a 5, that was about middle of the road. If he was an 8, that was worse. And I could say, "Jake, what would have to happen in your world to be a 5 again?" But it gave me as a parent a snapshot for where he was at and changed my parenting. But let me fast forward a decade when Jake, my son, during COVID has had a really rough time. Had virtually the same conversation a decade later during COVID. "Jake, how are you doing?" He was really suffering. And I said, "Do you remember in high school?" He says, "Okay, Dad, I'll text you every morning my number." He's in his late 20s now. And he would text me every day what he was. And it gave me a good sense because I could calibrate it as opposed to saying, "I don't know, I'm okay, I'm not okay." And one of the things I did when he was in high school, and I suggest this to parents, don't tell your child this, but write that number down on a calendar every day. And you might see a pattern emerge. Pre-COVID, the pattern for my son, Jake, was Sundays was his most anxious day. Academic challenges ahead of the week, social challenges, athletic challenges. So it's really important to calibrate it in some way and talk to our kids in ways that are going to work for them.
Do you think that there's anything, so we're biased over here given the work that we do, and you're familiar with the work that we do, but what advice do you have to parents? You've been offering some strategies for what they can do, but certainly there's limitations to what we as parents can do to support our kids. What do you think you would suggest to a family who's maybe struggling beyond what a parent can do to support them?
Yeah, so the very first thing I want to say to parents are that parents need to be in a good place. As I said earlier, they're the captains of the ship. And parents need to practice self-care. And we all, and I point to myself too, we all need to avoid saying the wrong things. So if a kid is anxious about returning to school or COVID or anything, we as parents, we want to soothe them and say, oh, don't worry about it. It's not that big a deal. You'll feel better, or it's all in your head. That's my favorite one. Of course, that's what anxiety is. It's all in our head. So we really have to avoid saying the bad things and say some of the good things. And they are simple, like, tell me more. Tell me what you're feeling. When we assume that we understand someone else's anxiety, that's trouble. And we also know that anxiety runs in families. We know if a parent has it, there's a 40% chance a child has it. No, my son has it, I'd say, based on me. We also know that girls experience anxiety twice as frequently as boys. So, these are very real. And this is part of our equation going forward. All sorts of anxiety, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, will not be an issue for a segment of the population, but for some adults and children, it will be long. And we talked about timeline for the virus. There is no timeline for post-traumatic stress disorder. And parents need to know when to seek help.
What are some of the things that they should be, what should they be looking for? What would be a sign of trouble?
Yeah, so I think we have to first say to our kids, you need to talk with us. If they won't talk to us, then we need to say, you have to find someone to talk to. I had that experience with my son. He wouldn't talk to me. And I said, all right, here's the deal. Talk to me or a therapist. He said, oh, I'd rather talk to a therapist and complain about your bad parenting. Okay, go for it. I'm sure they did a good measure of that. But I think we have to understand that our kids, it's okay for our kids to be down. We've had down days. I've had down days. So we need to not be so on top of them. One bad, day, one down day doesn't mean that they can't pull themselves up. But if we see it on a continual basis and they can't pull themselves up and we can't pull them up as parents, there's no shame in that. I always think about this. If you had a broken leg, you'd have it fixed and there'd be no shame about that. We're so good around things from the neck down. From the neck up, we're not so good. And there's a lot of shame and stigma around depression and around anxiety. Yet 40% of Americans now have anxiety. Wow. So we really have to approach that. And that's what you guys do all the time in your work and why it's so important. Talk about the stigma and talk about the value of getting help. There should be no shame. Anyone who breaks their leg or breaks their arm, people are signing their cast. You're telling your story. You're probably embellishing the story to make it sound great. That's just what we do.
Yeah.
But people don't say that around, anxiety. And I love parents who share with their children what's going on with them, not to burden them, but to inform them. And that's an important distinction. As parents, we really want to make sure we're informing, but not burdening. And I share with my kids all growing up and now about my own struggles. Again, not to burden, but to inform. And I think that's very valuable. An important distinction to be made, though.
It actually, I'll plug this again at the end, but we have a woman named Eileen Dawson. Shout out to Eileen if you're watching, who has reached out to us after watching the show she wants to share her story as a way of empowering people. I think you're absolutely right. We have all sorts of walks and fundraisers and things for physical ailments, for things that people are struggling with medically. But there is a huge amount of stigma for anyone who's suffering with mental health issues. And so as a result, people often suffer in silence. And, so what a beautiful way to support your child by talking with them openly, and maybe in the dark if you need to, so that they feel less self-conscious about it, or because it requires a great deal of bravery to speak up.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say is when our kids are not achieving in whatever way, maybe they're not doing their schoolwork, maybe they're not doing their chores at home, Maybe they're not socializing and interacting, which is so important. We have to ask ourselves, is it they won't do it, they won't do their schoolwork, or they can't do it, meaning they don't have the capacity. And we lose capacity when we're depressed, when we're anxious. So we always have to ask ourselves these questions. As a therapist, I always do with my clients. Is it that my client won't do something or can't? And sometimes it's a shade of gray, but the answer to that question for parents will help drive their approach. So if a child won't do it, that means, oh, they're being a lazy teen. They got to get out there and do it. But if they can't do it, if it's more shading toward that, then we have to look at what is the impediment. Is it anxiety? Is it depression? It's not that kids won't do something they can't. That's a whole different approach. And I think it's a very valuable question. When I do my talk, The Secret Life of Teens and Tweens, I talk about that a lot. It's a very valuable question. I use an example of my son when he was younger. He was so disorganized, but I realized in retrospect, it's not that he wouldn't be organized, he couldn't. He didn't have the capacity, he didn't have the maturity in the brain development. Changed my whole approach. Does that make some sense?
It does, it does. And Megan and I had a conversation the other day about there are new, jump in, Megan, to if you even know what I'm talking about, maybe if I get more
It's like
words
we've
out.
had many conversations. I'm not sure which one.
We're playing about how kids need to do so much advocacy for themselves right now in this pandemic learning.
Yeah, we were talking about how the specific example that we were talking about was, so a kid might need extra help, and instead of being able to go up to a teacher at the end of class, for example, now they might have to email a teacher. And so we were talking about how a parent might have to figure out, okay, when do I step in should I push my kid to ask for help? Should I be helping my kid draft the email to the teacher? Should I just expect my child to be doing this all on their own? Because it's so different where a middle schooler might have easily been able to go and then at the end of class be able to ask for help on their own, whereas drafting an email and sending an email to a teacher is a whole different experience. It's a whole different type of communication, and it's a very different way of advocating for yourself.
I think it's a very good point you're raising. And one of my basic parenting theories is this: whatever you do is probably going to be wrong. So let's start with that as a base, and let's go to the next set. So the next set is we have to partner with our kids, and that's a conversation, perhaps in the dark, saying, you know what, I'm just wondering if it would be helpful for me to reach out to your teacher. No, Mom, that would not be helpful. Please don't. Okay, that's great. So we want to really partner with our kids and say, what would be helpful? When they're younger, of course, we have to do more. But when they get to an age where they're in middle school and high school, that's about partnership. And it's about what would be helpful. And we also have to understand that kids are exhausted by this. They don't want to take that extra step. And we as parents, we all do this. In the moment, we think this is the most important thing going on in life. My daughter had her first child 6 weeks ago, and she was talking about feeding and all that. And he didn't seem like he was feeding one day. And she says, this is just overwhelming. It is in that moment. But overall, it was fine. The next day, he was eating twice the amount. So we tend to magnify things, and we have to really take a step back and look at the landscape, not over a day, but over that week, what is happening. And maybe that child is not reaching out to that teacher, and that's okay. They'll get into college eventually. They'll learn to do this and that eventually. We need to relax. And I'm really a good speaker about this, but it was a struggle for me as a parent just to pull back and say, it's going to be okay. Because you know what? The kids will be okay. Kids are very resilient. Yes, they're losing that interactive part. Yes, they're losing not just that skill, but that desire to be interactive at this point, which is a little frightening. Yes, we have increases of anxiety, but overall, I think kids will be okay. But okay means over time.
You're making me think, about, you highlighted this earlier, that kids in general have been experiencing a lot of losses, and it's hard not to notice that because you feel it. At the same time, though, I think that we as people and for our kids too are gaining quite a bit too, and it's hard to notice those things. You know, I was just saying this to somebody this weekend. If we don't experience discomfort, if we don't experience challenges, we don't experience change. And you know, I personally have loved seeing, I don't have a teen or a tween yet, but my kids are younger, but my 8-year-old has been learning how to cook. He's been learning how to clean more. And I just see a general sense of appreciation from him that, you know, wasn't there before, because not everything is given to him so automatically right now, you know, so he finds more appreciation when he actually gets to see somebody, because it's been a while since we've visited with anyone, you know, so.
I think that's an important point, Sarah. There are
Yeah.
some things that are opportunities, and we seized that in the beginning. Like I said, I'm going to clean out my closets, and I got the 2 closets. That was it. So we have to understand, like, we're not going to do it all, but I think your point is a really good one. There are a lot of things around, and it wouldn't be bad for parents to have that conversation, maybe in the dark again, and say, all right, we can talk about all the things that are challenging, that are upsetting, that are unnerving, but can we identify 1 or 2 things that have been positive? That have not been negative. Because I think that if we focus on those a little bit more, it's not going to counterbalance it. This has been an awful time. And I always say it's okay not to be okay, but it's important to recognize those. And if I were a parent of young kids, I would write them down, and I keep a running list of the positive things on the refrigerator, because kids are visual too. And that's a nice thing to see also. And they might say, oh, Mom, that's silly. Or in your case, you're a therapist, Mom, stop being a therapist. And no, you're being a mom, you know, that sort of thing.
That's great. Well, I do want to say, we're going to do a little shameless plug here. For anybody, you know, who's watching, and yes, we serve the Southborough community here, but, and I think John would chime in here too with some resources. But if you have a teen, tween, or just you in general are struggling at home with anxiety during this pandemic, and have questions, we are actually talking with John about the prospect of bringing him in for a lengthier talk. He's talked a few times this morning about some of the different talks he gives. So hopefully we can bring John back, and people can actually ask their questions and get some specific answers to what's going on with them and their family at home. But we want to encourage people to, you know, not struggle in silence, to reach out if they need help. And if that means, you know, we don't provide every service there is to offer at our department, but what we try to do is resource and referral. So, you know, whether it be a referral to one of John's talks, and say, actually, we're going to be talking about that later this month or this year, so please come back for that. Or maybe it's, you know, helping find your teen or tween or child or yourself a therapist to talk to, because it's just, whether you're talking to people in the dark or not, sometimes you just need that outside objective opinion. So we would happily help you if you're watching this and you're in need of some extra support. We also provide consultations, so maybe you're not sure if you need that and you just want to ask a few questions. So, so please don't hesitate to reach out. And John, we're so appreciative of having you on the show today.
Oh, it's really fun. I want to come back every week. Can I come back every week?
Yes.
Yes. You can just become a co-host.
Hey, invite me back anytime. This was a lot of fun. I'm all set. I'm all prepared.
Great.
But again, as we hope to have some continued conversation with you, to have you come back, and you're a fantastic resource for our community, but for so many, and we appreciate all the work that you do.
And I'm going to give a plug for you guys, because I did it for 30 years. Like, community mental health, what you guys are doing is critically important. As you know, in Massachusetts, we don't like to share town to town, and everyone likes to get help within their community. And you guys are a lifeline in what you provide and the information you put out to the people who live in the town. And I'm guessing to the employees too of the town who probably
Mhm.
rely on you in ways that they relied on me over the years. So I just wanted to honor what you've done. We honored teachers in the spring and called them heroes, and you guys likewise. Really amazing what
thank
you've done. You
you.
had to pick yourself up to be professional for other people, and that's just amazing. I'm so impressed.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for saying that. We really appreciate it. It's an honor. All three of us really love our jobs, and but so as I mentioned earlier, we have a woman named Eileen Dawson who reached out to us to say, I have a story to tell. I have had my own challenges with mental health, and I have struggled. It's been a journey, and I've come out on the other side, and I would love to do something with my story to help others. Do you have any ideas? So Eileen is coming on Coffee Talk next week to talk with us about her own personal story. And we're so appreciative of that. So she'll be with us next Tuesday, which is the 13th. So we hope that you'll tune in then. And John, again, thank you so much for coming on
Really,
today's
really
show.
a lot of fun. And I meant it. Invite me back anytime. That would be a pleasure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.